what I wanted really to do was, I wanted to, apologies to reduce time given the technological problems. So I wanted to just try and summarize what we've got this very short sugya in which the Gemara discusses Mosar HaShemen SheBaNer, according to the Tanakhama it's us, and according to Rabbi Zobin it's Muktza. So what would be the Muktza going on over here? So basically this is not a very structured share. I'm just going to share with you what I came across in the Rishonim and Achronim for the potential candidates of Muktza that are floating around here. And the reason this has sort of become the case study of so much of Muktza is because it brings together so many different topics. So candidate number one was really, we discussed last year, was really built on the Rif and the Rambam and the Rabbi Hanana, who all came from one base of Medrash, who either explain or have a girsa in the Gemara that the Muktza we're talking about over here is a Muktza of mistapik. They say it's also mistapik min HaShemen. You're not allowed to use the Shemen. The issa isn't movement of moving the Shemen. The issa is using the Shemen. And the Ram said that the reason is because mistapik min HaShemen SheBaNer chayv mishum mechaber. If you use the Shemen in the Ner, then you are transgressing mechaber, extinguishing the flame. So that was the Ram's suggestion for the melacha, that the melacha is mechaber. So and that's why it's also mistapik, because since if you drain oil off the lamp, then that would be mechaber. Therefore, you're not allowed to drain the oil off the lamp when it's burning, and therefore it becomes Muktza for the whole of Shabbos. It becomes Muktza for the whole of Shabbos because it was Muktza at the beginning of Shabbos for use. So there's a new type of Muktza basically. There's a Muktza with respect to movement, what we're familiar with Muktza, you don't take something, and there's a Muktza with respect to histapik, which means don't use the oil on Shabbos. And since you're not allowed to use it at the beginning of Shabbos because of mechaber, then you can't use it the whole of Shabbos because it's mikro diskatzoyos. But now it's set aside, it's blocked on Shabbos for that sort of use. That's the Muktza. That's what the Ram says. The Magen Avraham says 2 points on this really. The first point he says is that according to that, it wouldn't be Muktza on Yom Tov because on Yom Tov there's no issa to help yourself to oil. Gram kippoi. Indirect causation of kibbutz is not also on Yom Tov. That's the first thing he says. And the second thing he says is that he thinks there's another Muktza floating around over here, which is the Muktza machmas mitzvah, is katsoi lemitzvasoi, which really we saw Tosfos really mentioned already on Daf mem base, mem gimel amud aleph, mem base on base. At the beginning of the sugya, Tosfos said that there's this katsoi lemitzvasoi. So the first candidate for, so what's the Muktza that our Gemara says that you're not allowed to do? The first candidate is, all it means is a Muktza with respect to using the oil, because you're not allowed to use up the oil, because that would be mechaber. The second candidate for Muktza is katsoy lemitzvasoi, if this is a ner shel mitzvah. So according to that, if you had a ner which wasn't shel mitzvah, then on Shabbos it would still be also because of the Ram's Muktza of mechaber. And if it was on Yom Tov, it would be Muktza completely. And if on Yom Tov you had a ner that was the mitzvah, it would be Muktza because of the mitzvah. So there's two factors that you need to consider. The Gemara doesn't tell us whether this is talking about a ner that's just because you want lighting in your house, or whether it's talking about a ner which is for mitzvah, and that will depend on this discussion. So that's the first two reasons that come in the Ran and in the Poskim on the Shulchan Aruch, when the Shulchan Aruch brings this Halacha. The next thing that's spoken about to consider is once you're not allowed to use the oil, is it possible that now makes the oil fully Muktza? Because something which is useless surely is a candidate for Muktza. So it's true that the Ran explains that really this starts off as also is stapik. You're not allowed to use the oil because if you would use up the oil, let's say you want to help yourself to some of the oil on Shabbos from the lamp, for dressing your salads or anointing yourself, you wouldn't be allowed to do so because that would be removing the oil from the lamps and therefore indirectly causing kibbutz. But would it be also to, now that you can't do that and it's Muktza with respect to use, surely there should be a second stage Muktza that clicks in, that it should now become also even to move because it's useless, and something that's useless should become also to move. So that's a second stage discussion.
Can I just ask? So one thing, when we're saying this whole logic that it's mechaber, I don't understand what that's got to do with Muktza at all, because it's just a melacha. So you're not allowed to take the oil when it's in the lamp because it's mechaber. So how does that relate to Muktza in any way?
So this is the chiddush of the Ran. That's why I found this one interesting. The Ran says, since you're not allowed to take the oil because of a melacha, therefore this thing is set aside. Look, let's take another type of Muktza, a pen. So, a pen is Muktza. What sort of Muktza is? It's called kli shemelachta l'issa. In other words, because the pen can't be used for writing, and it's a kli, therefore it's not omeid for its main use, and therefore it's Muktza. Because it's a kli, it's not a completely Muktza item, and therefore if you found another use for it, you could use it. So that's called soich gufay. Or let's use the example of a hammer. The one I used last week. A hammer is Muktza because it's omeid for hammering things in, which is also on Shabbos. Therefore, it becomes Muktza. But since it's a kli, if I find another use for it, I'll be allowed to use it. So if I have a coconut that I want to crack open, I'll be allowed to crack open the coconut. So the Ran is arguing that the oil, even though it's not a kli shemelachta l'issa, nonetheless, it's not kli at all, and it's not melachta l'issa in and of in itself. It's not kli, and it's not being used for an issa. But nonetheless, since there is an issa on its use because of mechaber, therefore the fact is I can't take the oil, and therefore it becomes a Muktza. If Muktza means not muchem, translation Muktza is it's not muchem, it's not prepared for Shabbos use, it's not omeid for Shabbos use. So is this oil omeid for Shabbos use? No, it's not, because you can't help yourself to the oil, and therefore the oil is also this topic, and therefore the oil is Muktza with respect to use. So argues the Ran. And some of the poskim say, now that the oil is also to use, oil is useless. I mean, if you can't use it for anything, what you meant to use it for, and therefore it would be even also l'tiltul because it would be Muktza. So that's the second stage Muktza that would click in. There are other achronim that say maybe that would apply to oil, but if there's a wax candle, it shouldn't be worse than any other kli shemelachta l'issa, and therefore if you needed to use it l'soich gufay, you'd be allowed to. So if you wanted to use the wax candle as that went out as a door stopper, you would be allowed to do that because it's no worse than any kli, and it therefore would be a kli shemelachta l'issa. That's what comes out in the poskim. I have to tell you, as much as I've tried to say this convincingly, I don't really understand any of this exactly, because there's something a bit paradoxical over here. You're not allowed to help yourself to the oil because you're not allowed to use it because of the melacha of kippur, and therefore it's not set aside for use, and therefore it's Muktza. But when it is set aside for use, I'm using it to burn a candle, to burn a flame.
Exactly.
So there's something a little bit circular in this, which is, it's true I can't use it for anything else, but I can use it for what the oil is designed for, which is as a lamp, as a lamp for producing fire. And more than that, it's not also to move around on Shabbos, because on Shabbos, I mean, were it not for other Muktzas that we'll talk about, but if we're just looking at the Muktzas that we've discussed so far, it should even be allowed to move it around, because if I want to move it from room to room to light up another room, why shouldn't I be allowed to do that? So I'm not sure exactly that I understand this argument. The Ran seems to be saying that it's true that it's being burnt as a fire, but that's not a use. A use means I'm taking something myself. I'm taking a hammer and using it. I'm taking a pen and using it. A kedi is something that I use to act, to express, to do something with. A lamp just sits there burning its way calmly through the oil. It's doing something, but I'm not using it in the same way. So the Ran says that's a Muktza of Osir Istapik. Well, that seems to be the lomdus of the Ran. Interesting Svarah. Then the Achronim extend that to, well, therefore I shouldn't even be allowed to move it, because if I can't use the oil for anything else, I can't move it. But that reality I struggle to understand. Once the light goes out, maybe you can't use it for anything. But paradoxically, that the whole time the light is a light, you should be able to use it, unless we come on to other svaras of bosses and things like that, because I should be able to move it from room to room to light up. So there's something that needs a little bit of thinking around all this. So Adam.
Yeah, I mean, the further problem is obviously, I suppose we talk about the different types of objects, and as you say, there's kli shemelachta l'issa.
Yes.
Kli shemelachta l'issa, there are two allowances: the soik gufa and the soik mitzvah.
Yes.
You want to use the face, so you've got to establish what the object is. If it's kli shemelachta l'issa, as opposed to makmat gufa, it's essentially like a stone.
Yeah.
It's essentially thing. Then you've got to still establish what it is, and therefore I'm supporting what you're saying. It's still potentially, if it was in the wrong position, you need to move it because you wanted to use the place where it was sitting. Then it's important to establish if it's pinch-mark to listen, you could still move the item.
You're correct, but I'm saying even more than that. You can. Why shouldn't you be able to move it? Because without allowance, if you want the light, if you have a lamp in your dining room and you want to move it to your lounge, why shouldn't you be allowed to move it to get light there?
Well, let's see. Certain makomas, there are certain objects.
Certain makoma is something that's fundamentally immovable.
But there are some Muktza items which, even though they can't have the Torah goof on, they still like a pen. Generally, there's not many the Torah goofers for a pen. Hypothetically, if you just have a pen, what Torah goofer you've got? But a hammer, you've got a Torah goofer you can crack your nuts with. Your pen, there's only the Torah makomas. On the floor, you move it out the way. So even if it's just the Torah makoma, it's still could move.
That is true, but a hammer or a pen is fundamentally Muktza, that you're not allowed to be in batal to it, because its default use is a melachot use. But since it's a kli, it's made for any potential use that comes up, and therefore I can move it the tzorich gufa, the tzorich makoma. Here, I'm arguing that the oil, the Ran is saying that the oil is somewhat analogous to a Muktza machmasisa because it is sort of shemer yechaber, and therefore I can't help myself to the oil. And the Achronim are saying if you can't help yourself to the oil, then it's useless. You shouldn't be able to use it. I'm arguing it's not useless at all. On the contrary, I'm using it to light up a room, and I should be allowed to move it from room to room to light. So it's stronger than the tzorich makoma or using the hammer to crack a coconut. It's more than that. I'm using it for what it's designed for its primary use. Its job is to be a lamp, and I want the lamp in one room or another room. What would make that a useless object? So again, just to summarize, just so we don't emerge completely confused from all of this, what we've discussed, we're going to in this year, in the time available, I hope, look at four suggestions or nominations for the Muktza that's floating around over here, and not after they argue. I'm not suggesting that what one place says argues with another. There's scenarios when one would apply and the other wouldn't apply, and we're just trying to put them all together. Suggestion number one is the Ran, who says that the Isra is shemer yechaber. Not shemer yechaber. By helping yourself to the oil, you would be putting the flame out. Therefore, you can't take oil out of the lamp. Therefore, you can't use the oil. The oil is Muktza with respect to using it. And therefore, it remains Muktza even once the lamp has anyway gone out. That's halacha number one. The post can discuss whether we should or shouldn't extend that to an issa tiltul. And I'm saying I struggle a bit to understand whether you extend it to tiltul or not. But forget my personal struggles. That's an interesting discussion. Would you extend it to tiltul or not? That's Muktza number one. You can't help yourself to the oil because by doing so you would extinguish the light, and therefore it's Muktza with respect to using it up. Number one. Suggestion number two is it's Muktza for the mitzvah. That, like Tosis has already told us, that's set aside for mitzvah use, and therefore that's a Muktza. And there'd be enough communities between the two reasons. If you had a situation where you had a light Shabbos candles, both reasons would apply. Shabbos, you can't extinguish it, and it's Muktza because it's a mitzvah, because they're Shabbos light. If it was Yom Tov, then the extinguishing reason wouldn't apply. And if it wasn't for the mitzvah, it was just a light around the house, then the mitzvah wouldn't apply. That's the two Muktza that are floating around. The third candidate for Muktza here is bossis. And here I printed the Gemara on the source sheets. The Gemara says that Hanach l'Shemen, the what's the language of Gemara? That's my source sheets. Yes, this is the Gemara on Daf Memzayin Mem Dalef. Omer of Hanach l'Ner Shemen l'Ptila, held an asa bossis l'Dava asa. So the Gemara says that the Shalheves is Muktza, and therefore the Ner, the Shemen, and the Pesila are all bosses to the Muktza Shalheves. So this is a third candidate for the Muktza floating around. Now, there's a number of interesting things in this. First of all, what is the Muktza of a Shalheves? And secondly, why did the Ran not mention the Muktza of Shalheves? Why didn't he mention that as the reason why the oil is asa? So again, just to summarize, there is a Gemara in Daf Mem Zayin, which without much explanation says that a flame is Muktza, and therefore, number one. And number two, the second chiddush of the Gemara is, therefore the wick and the oil and the lamp are all also Muktza because of the din of bossis. So let's just, and if that's correct, then why did the Ran not bring that up? Why did the Ran say that the problem is because of you're not allowed to help yourself to the oil? Should we have a Mefurish Gemara, a few daf time, in 4 daf in advance, in which the Gemara says that it's a bosses to the Shalavas? So first of all, just a bit of background. Why is the Shalavas Muktza? So the Rishonim don't speak much about it. The Gemara, by the way, doesn't even say what's Muktza. The Gemara just says that the Psila, the Shemen, and the nail, bosses to Dava also. It doesn't say what's the Dava also. Rashi says it's the Shalavas, the flame. What's the Muktza? The Rishonim barely speak about it. The only Rishon I could find that says anything on this was the Ritva on the spot, and the Ritva says that it's Muktza because the nair is something which is osaligabo. You're not allowed to touch it. So I don't know what that exactly means. I guess he means you're not allowed to touch a flame because you might put it out. In which case it's another variant of Yechaber. You're not allowed to touch a flame because by touching a flame you might put it out, and by putting it out you'd extinguish it. That would be the melacha. Maybe he even means by touching, even if you don't put it out, you diminish it. Even if you just pass your hand through the flame, you're sort of cutting off some of the flame, and therefore that would diminish it, and therefore be also, and therefore everything else comes muktzah. The Chazon Ish says that's not. He just says because it's not normal to move the flame around. Again, I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, it is normal to move the flame around if you want to move from room to room. Rabbi Zobin has a piece about this in which he's discussing the modern day scenario about whether you can move filaments around, and he says the reason it's muktzah is because the flame is nothing. It's ein b'mamish. So it's not a keli. It's got no. There's nothing. There's no. It doesn't fit any of the normal categories of useful items, objects, which should be mutter. Moshe Feinstein says a similar sort of story. He says it's not a keli. A flame is not a keli, and therefore it's not omed. A keli is something that's omed for human use. A flame just sits there. It exists, but it's not omed for use in that way. It's just its own entity that's not omed for use. It's not a utensil that's an extension of human abilities, and therefore is usable. And therefore they say that's why it's muktzah. Be that as it may, the question over here is why does the Ran not bring up this svara of that it's a bosses to Dava Asa? So I was thinking that the truth is that it's not so. The psila I hear is a bosses. The flame sits on the wick. Does the flame sit on all the oil? Is all the oil a bosses? So it's a little unclear to think about. If you have a Muktza pen sitting on top of a shelf, so I understand the shelf is one unit, and the coin is sitting on top of this single shelf or the table. The table is an entity. The coin sits on top of it. The flame sits on top of the wick. I hear that. Does the flame sit on top of the whole pool of the oil? Is the oil one entity? I mean, it's liquid. It's made of. Is it all one thing on which the flame is sitting?
The oil is drawn on the wick. I mean, the flame is there because the oil.
The oil, a little bit of the oil gets drawn up into the wick, but is the rest of the oil a bossis? Is it really a bossis for the flame? Does the flame sit on it? So there's again. I was wondering if in the Ran there's a bit of a sort of a circle of a sorrow over here. If you're allowed to help yourself to the oil, I don't think the oil would be a bossis to the flame. Because every bit of oil is separate. Imagine on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, let's say, where there's no Isra of Machaber, and I could scoop out some of the oil and use it as a salad dressing. So why would the oil be a bossis for the flame then? It'd be like if I have a coin, a pen sitting on top. If I have lots of pieces, I have lots of pieces on the floor, and I put off one of them, I put a pen. Does that make all of them a bossis? Of course not. Each piece is separate. So oil is made up of many bits, many pieces. If I was allowed to scoop out some of the oil for my salad dressing, then the oil wouldn't. Then how could I argue that the whole oil was a bossis? It's only because of the other Muktza, which the Ran identifies, in which he says I'm not allowed to help myself to the oil because of Shemir Yechaber, that now you can come and say, okay, so the whole oil is dedicated for the use of the flame, and therefore it's a sort of conceptual bossis. It's an interesting sort of bossis. It's not that the flame physically sits on top of the oil, but it's that the whole oil is there to serve the flame, and therefore that's a bossis of sorts. So I was wondering, maybe I don't know if you find this convincing in the language of the Ran or not. I give it over to the gentleman of the jury to make a decision on that.
Oil, liquid's different, isn't it?
Liquid is different because it doesn't physically sit on top of it. The flame doesn't physically sit on top of the oil, and more than that, what makes one piece of liquid connected to another piece of liquid? So
that's what I meant. The liquid is all connected, very much so, as a whole unit in the way convex or.
Yes and no.
You know,
In the normal
Well,
category,
the pieces of wood that you were talking about, they're definitely separate items, aren't they?
the piece of wood is a moshel. Whenever you give a moshel, the reason for the moshel is because the moshel is easier than the nimshel.
Right.
I agree with you that the wood is an easy case. They're literally separate items. But I want to ask, in normal hilchos bosses, does the flame sit on top of the oil? It doesn't rest on the oil in a normal sense. It's attached to the wick. I mean, especially if you picture, let's say there's a tube there, right, in a lamp. Maybe it's resting on the lamp, on the KD. It's not resting on the oil. It's not sitting on top of the oil. Number one. Number two, the oil is the oil all one entity or not? Well, that good depends on the halachas. If I was allowed to scoop out some of the oil and use it as a salad dressing on Shabbos, then what makes this oil, again, imagine a full bathtub of oil with a flame on one corner of it, a massive lantern. So what makes the oil on a meter away from the flame, a bosses for the flame over here? So if I was allowed to, the answer would be, because it's a more conceptual sort of bosses. The Gemara, when it's telling us that the oil is a bosses for the flame, is being mechadesh a new lomtus over here. That even though the flame's not sitting on top of it, nonetheless, there's a bosses type relationship between the flame and the oil, because all the oil is going to feed into the flame. That's a chiddush. That's a new type of bosses. It's not the classic type of bosses. The classic type of bosses is an object sitting on a shelf or an object sitting on a table.
What we see in our modern day is that every pen is also a bosses because it holds the ink or the.
Because you don't need to come onto that. Sorry, it's more than that. It's a klisha melachot issa. A pen is a KD, and it's melachot issa. It's used for writing, and therefore it's Muktza. It doesn't need the second degree of Muktza bosses. No, bosses only gets the Muktza of the. No, bosses gets the Muktza of the object that is a bosses for. So what a klisha melachot issa, but the Gemara isn't saying that a ner is a klisha melachot issa. It's saying that the ner is a bosses of the shalhaves. So the lantern itself, maybe the psila, the wick, maybe, but the oil's not a classic bosses, unless the Gemara means a svara that the whole oil is feeding and supporting the flame. But if you're allowed to help yourself to the oil from one end of the flame, one end of the pool, then it's not all feeding, helping flame. So maybe that's what the Ram svara is. Since you're not allowed to help yourself to the oil because that would be kiboy, that would be gram of kiboy. Therefore, the whole oil is a bosses. The svara I think is very nice svara. Does it fit the language of the Ran? I'm not completely convinced. So Rabbi, have a look at the Ran and tell me if you think there's a good shot. I don't see that the oil's a bosses to the wick. The wick is an object. The wick is sitting over here. What's that got to do with the oil over here? Unless it's all one entity. But what makes the oil one entity? But part of the oil is my salad dressing supply, my anointing supply, only because of Hilchos Shabbos that says I'm not allowed to use the oil for anything else. That also is nothing.
Floating on our own, with a Muktza object floating in a basin of water, the water there.
I actually don't know. I'm not sure. And I don't know if it's only talking about that form of lantern. I don't know. The seal, by the way, the Rishonim explain, because don't forget in our Mishnah, it's talking about where it's mataftef. So they say it's a psila that's hanging over the edge. It's resting on the lantern and it's dripping down. I don't know. No one makes it so kimta. They're only talking about where it's where it's a floating wick. I know. I'm simply showing you. I said this year. I'm simply showing you my confusion around this whole topic. I don't know. It's a floating bosses or bosses. Yeah. Okay. I've also run out of time, so I'll stop here. I thought I'd finish the sukkah today, but Mitzvah Hashem will finish it next time. So, yeah.
Go ahead. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. So halacha l'maisa. All the poskim come to the conclusion. All the poskim, the ones I saw, Rabbi Shimon Zalman Auerbach, the Moshe Feinstein, they all assume that an electric filament to make ikar hadin should not be a bosses like a shalhaves. They don't think it's the same. But they all say one should be machmir. But all the more recent poskim are makel with the modern day lamps, which have no shalhaves at all, like an LED and a fluorescent and things like that.
You just twist
Yes,
around.
that would not be a bosses and would not be Muktza.
Not the whole lamp.
Correct. Yeah.